For most of history, war meant weapons, armies, and destruction. Today, war looks different. No bombs, no troops, no declarations. Instead, markets are cut off, supply chains are broken, currencies are weaponized, technology is restricted. The world has entered a new Cold War, one fought through economics instead of weapons, and most people do not realize it has already begun. For most of modern history, war was defined by weapons, armies, and territory. Power was measured in tanks, missiles, and the size of standing forces. But as the world entered the late 20th century, the cost of direct military confrontation between major powers became too high to sustain. Nuclear deterrence made total war unthinkable, while globalization intertwined economies so deeply that traditional conflict threatened mutual destruction. What emerged instead was a transformation of warfare itself. The battlefield did not disappear, it moved. Markets, currencies, trade routes, and supply chains quietly replaced borders and trenches. This shift did not happen overnight. During the Cold War, economic rivalry already played a role, but it was secondary to ideological and military confrontation. In the decades that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, globalization created an illusion of permanent economic peace. Nations traded freely, capital flowed across borders, and supply chains stretched across continents. The assumption was simple: economic interdependence would prevent conflict. Yet beneath this optimism, a new form of competition was taking shape, one that relied not on firepower, but on leverage. Economic power proved far more flexible than military force. It could be applied selectively, scaled gradually, and denied responsibility when consequences emerged. Sanctions, tariffs, export controls, and financial restrictions allowed states to exert pressure without firing a single shot. These tools operated within legal frameworks, international institutions, and financial systems that appeared neutral on the surface, but their impact was often as severe as traditional warfare. Entire industries could be crippled, currencies destabilized, and long-term growth undermined through economic means alone. Global news increasingly reflected this transformation. Trade disputes replaced military standoffs and headlines. Currency movements became geopolitical signals. Decisions made by central banks reverberated across borders, reshaping capital flows and economic stability. When major economies imposed tariffs or restricted access to technology, the effects cascaded through global markets. Companies scrambled to adapt. Governments responded with countermeasures. What appeared as economic policy was in reality strategic maneuvering. The role of the United States illustrates this shift with particular clarity. As the largest economy and the issuer of the world's dominant currency, the United States possessed unmatched economic leverage. Control over financial infrastructure, trade access, and capital markets allowed Washington to influence global outcomes without deploying troops. This power expanded as financial globalization deepened. Payment systems, reserve currencies, and investment flows became instruments of statecraft. The line between economics and national security blurred until it nearly vanished. Other major powers took notice. China, the European Union, and regional blocs began reassessing their vulnerabilities. Dependence on foreign markets, technologies, or financial systems now represented strategic risk. Governments spoke openly about economic security, resilience, and autonomy. Policies once guided purely by efficiency shifted toward redundancy and control. The logic of globalization changed. Cheap production was no longer the only priority. Reliability and sovereignty gained equal importance. This transformation redefined what conflict looked like in the modern era. Instead of open confrontation, competition unfolded through regulations, standards, and market access. Countries sought to shape global rules in ways that favored their interests. Trade agreements became strategic tools. Infrastructure investment carried geopolitical weight. Even seemingly technical decisions, such as setting technology standards or approving mergers, acquired strategic significance. Power was exercised quietly, often invisibly, through mechanisms most people never associated with warfare. Economic statistics revealed the scale of this shift. Trade flows became more volatile as tariffs and restrictions altered long-established patterns. Investment increasingly followed political alignment rather than pure economic return. Supply chains that once prioritized efficiency were redesigned for resilience. Analysts documented rising costs, slower growth, and increased inflationary pressure as a result. The economic battlefield imposed real costs, not only on rivals, but on domestic populations as well. The illusion that markets existed outside politics collapsed. Corporations discovered that access to markets could be revoked overnight. Assets could be frozen. Technologies could be restricted. Entire sectors could be reclassified as strategic. Business decisions now required geopolitical calculations. Investors assessed not only financial fundamentals, but political alignment and regulatory risk. The private sector became an active participant in a conflict it had not chosen. Public discourse struggled to keep pace with these changes. Traditional narratives of war and peace no longer applied cleanly. Economic measures were framed as defensive or administrative, even when their impact was deeply coercive. This ambiguity made the new conflict harder to recognize and harder to debate. Citizens experienced its effects through higher prices, disrupted supply, and slower growth, often without understanding the underlying causes. The global economy itself became more fragmented. Regions aligned economically with trusted partners. Cross-border integration slowed. Strategic decoupling entered mainstream discussion. What once appeared as a single interconnected system began to fracture into overlapping blocks, each prioritizing its own security and influence. Economists warned that this fragmentation could reduce efficiency and innovation, but policymakers increasingly accepted these costs as the price of stability. History offered a sobering parallel. The original Cold War reshaped global institutions, alliances, and economic structures for generations. The new version, fought through economic instruments, promised to be equally transformative. But unlike its predecessor, this conflict lacked clear boundaries or endpoints. There were no formal declarations, no treaties to signal resolution. The struggle unfolded continuously, embedded in everyday economic activity. The most striking feature of this new Cold War was its subtlety. There were no sirens, no mobilizations, no visible front lines. Yet its effects were pervasive. Decisions made in boardrooms, ministries, and central banks carried consequences once reserved for military strategy. Economic policy became a weapon, and global markets became the terrain on which power was contested. The transition from missiles to markets marked a fundamental shift in how the world understood conflict. War had not disappeared, it had evolved. And as economic competition intensified, the risks of miscalculation grew. In a system defined by interdependence, pressure applied to one actor rarely stopped there. It spread, often unpredictably, through networks that bound the global economy together. The new Cold War had already begun, not with an explosion, but with a contract. Not with a declaration, but with a regulation. And as nations adapted to this reality, the world entered an era where economic decisions carried the weight of strategic confrontation, an era where power was measured not by weapons deployed, but by leverage exercised in silence. Sanctions, trade wars, and financial restrictions have become the primary weapons of the new Cold War. Unlike missiles or troops, these tools operate quietly, embedded within the global economic system, yet their impact can be just as destructive. Over the past decades, economic coercion has evolved from a supplementary tactic into a central pillar of geopolitical strategy. States discovered that by controlling access to markets, capital, and technology, they could exert pressure without crossing the threshold of open conflict. Sanctions were once rare and symbolic, applied mainly to signal disapproval. In the modern era, they have transformed into complex, multi-layered systems designed to isolate entire economies. Financial sanctions restrict access to banking networks, freeze reserves, and limit the ability to transact in dominant currencies. Trade sanctions target specific industries, technologies, or resources, disrupting production and long-term growth. These measures are often justified as defensive or humanitarian, yet their economic consequences extend far beyond political elites. Inflation rises, currencies weaken, and ordinary citizens bear the cost. Global news repeatedly demonstrates how sanctions reshape economic realities. When access to international payment systems is restricted, trade slows almost immediately. Importers struggle to secure essential goods. Export revenues collapse. Domestic industries dependent on foreign components face shortages and rising costs. Economists have documented how sanction regimes can reduce national output by significant margins over time, particularly when restrictions persist for years rather than months. Unlike military strikes, these effects accumulate gradually, making them harder to attribute and easier to normalize. Trade wars represent another front in this economic confrontation. Tariffs, quotas, and export controls are deployed to protect domestic industries or weaken competitors. While often framed as economic policy disputes, trade wars carry strategic intent. By raising costs and reducing market access, states aim to reshape global supply chains and shift production back within their sphere of influence. Recent trade conflicts demonstrated how quickly tariffs could escalate, triggering retaliation and spreading disruption across multiple sectors. Industries from agriculture to manufacturing found themselves caught in cycles of uncertainty, forced to adapt to rapidly changing rules. Economic statistics reveal the cost of these conflicts. Tariffs increase prices for consumers, reduce competitiveness, and slow investment. Studies show that prolonged trade disputes lead to lower growth, reduced productivity, and higher inflation. While some sectors benefit from protection, the broader economy absorbs the losses. Governments often justify these costs as necessary sacrifices in a larger strategic struggle, reinforcing the idea that economic pain is an acceptable substitute for military confrontation. Financial weapons extend beyond sanctions and tariffs. Control over global capital flows has become a powerful lever. Access to investment markets, credit ratings, and financial infrastructure shapes the ability of states and corporations to operate internationally. Restrictions on investment can starve industries of capital, delay development, and weaken long-term prospects. Rating downgrades increase borrowing costs, compounding fiscal pressure. These mechanisms operate within ostensibly neutral financial systems, yet their deployment reflects political alignment and strategic priorities. The dominance of certain currencies amplifies this power. When international trade and finance rely heavily on a single monetary system, exclusion becomes a potent threat. Countries subject to financial restrictions face immediate liquidity shortages, even if their underlying economies remain functional. Central banks scramble to stabilize currencies, often at the expense of growth. Businesses lose access to financing, supply chains fracture, and confidence erodes. Economists describe this phenomenon as financial strangulation, a process that unfolds without visible confrontation but produces deep structural damage. Technology restrictions have become an increasingly important dimension of economic warfare. Export controls targeting advanced components, software, and infrastructure aim to slow technological progress and limit strategic capabilities. By restricting access to critical technologies, states attempt to maintain competitive advantage while hindering rivals' development. These measures have long-term implications, affecting innovation ecosystems, research collaboration, and industrial capacity. The global technology sector, once a symbol of borderless cooperation, now reflects deepening fragmentation. Corporations find themselves at the center of this conflict. Multinational companies must navigate overlapping regulations, sanctions regimes, and trade restrictions. Decisions about where to invest, source materials, or sell products now carry geopolitical weight. Compliance failures can result in severe penalties, reputational damage, or exclusion from key markets. As a result, businesses increasingly align strategies with political realities rather than purely economic considerations. The private sector becomes an extension of state policy, whether intentionally or not. The financial impact of economic warfare extends far beyond targeted states. Global markets react to uncertainty with volatility. Commodity prices fluctuate as trade routes shift. Supply disruptions create inflationary pressure across regions. Investors reassess risk, leading to capital flight from exposed markets. These ripple effects illustrate a core feature of the new Cold War. Economic weapons rarely affect only their intended targets. In an interconnected system, pressure spreads outward, influencing allies, neutral parties, and even the initiators themselves. Developing economies are particularly vulnerable. Many depend on access to global markets, foreign investment, and stable financial conditions. When trade routes are disrupted or financial systems fragmented, these countries face disproportionate harm. International institutions warn that prolonged economic conflict could reverse decades of development progress, increasing poverty and instability. This raises ethical questions about the use of economic coercion, especially when humanitarian consequences are significant. At the same time, the effectiveness of sanctions and trade wars remains contested. While they can inflict substantial economic damage, their ability to achieve political objectives is uncertain. Targeted governments often adapt by seeking alternative partners, developing domestic substitutes, or strengthening regional ties. Over time, these adaptations can reduce the effectiveness of economic weapons and accelerate the formation of parallel systems. What begins as a tool of dominance may ultimately weaken the influence of those who wield it. Global reactions reflect this dynamic. Countries subject to repeated economic pressure invest in resilience. They diversify trade, develop alternative financial channels, and reduce dependence on vulnerable systems. Even nations not directly targeted observe these developments and adjust accordingly. The result is a gradual reconfiguration of the global economy, driven not by efficiency, but by security considerations. Public perception also evolves. Citizens experience the consequences of economic warfare through rising prices, reduced availability of goods, and slower growth. Political narratives frame these hardships as necessary sacrifices in a larger struggle. Over time, however, tolerance for economic pain may erode, creating domestic pressure on policymakers. This interplay between external strategy and internal stability adds complexity to the use of economic weapons. The new Cold War thus operates through layers of economic pressure rather than open confrontation. Sanctions, trade wars, and financial restrictions function as instruments of influence, capable of reshaping economies and alliances. Yet their widespread use carries systemic risk. Each deployment weakens trust in global institutions and accelerates fragmentation. The more frequently economic weapons are used, the more the global system adapts to survive without them. What emerges is a paradox. Economic warfare is chosen precisely because it avoids military escalation, yet its cumulative effects may prove just as destabilizing. By turning markets into battlegrounds, states transform everyday economic activity into strategic conflict. The result is a world where growth slows, uncertainty rises, and cooperation becomes increasingly difficult. Sanctions and trade wars are no longer exceptions. They are the language of modern power. And as their use expands, the line between economic policy and conflict continues to blur, defining an era where wars are fought not with weapons, but with access, leverage, and control over the systems that sustain global life. As the new Cold War intensified, supply chains emerged as one of the most powerful and underestimated strategic weapons. What had once been optimized for efficiency, speed, and cost reduction was suddenly redefined as a matter of national security. For decades, global production networks stretched across continents, connecting factories, ports, and consumers in an intricate web designed to minimize expenses and maximize profit. This system delivered unprecedented growth and low prices, but it also created deep dependencies. When geopolitical tensions rose, those dependencies transformed into vulnerabilities. The modern supply chain was never politically neutral. It reflected historical power balances, labor costs, and access to resources. However, globalization encouraged the belief that economic integration would override strategic rivalry. Companies outsourced production to regions with cheaper labor, governments welcomed foreign investment, and consumers benefited from lower prices. Over time, entire industries became concentrated in specific regions. Semiconductors clustered in East Asia. Rare earth processing centralized in a handful of countries. Pharmaceutical ingredients flowed through complex, opaque networks. These concentrations improved efficiency but reduced resilience. The shift from efficiency to security began gradually, then accelerated rapidly. Global disruptions exposed how fragile the system had become. Factory shutdowns, port congestion, and transport bottlenecks revealed that even minor interruptions could ripple across the entire world economy. Industries from automotive manufacturing to electronics production stalled due to missing components. Governments and corporations realized that control over supply chains meant control over economic stability itself. Economic data illustrated the scale of the problem. Production delays caused measurable declines in output across multiple sectors. Inflationary pressure increased as shortages drove prices higher. Companies reported rising costs and declining margins. Consumers faced longer wait times and higher prices for everyday goods. Analysts noted that supply chain disruptions contributed significantly to global inflation, amplifying existing economic stress. What initially appeared as a logistical issue became a macroeconomic shock. In the context of the new Cold War, supply chains became tools of leverage. States recognized that restricting access to critical inputs could weaken rivals without direct confrontation. Export controls, licensing requirements, and investment restrictions targeted specific choke points. By limiting the flow of key components, governments aimed to slow technological progress, disrupt industrial output, and gain negotiating power. These measures were often framed as defensive, but their strategic intent was unmistakable. Semiconductors exemplified this transformation. Advanced chips became essential to everything from consumer electronics to military systems. Control over their design, production, and distribution carried enormous strategic weight. Restrictions on technology transfer and manufacturing equipment reshaped the global semiconductor industry almost overnight. Companies were forced to reconsider sourcing strategies, invest in domestic capacity, or seek alternative partners. The economic cost was significant, but governments increasingly viewed these investments as necessary insurance against strategic vulnerability. Energy supply chains also gained strategic importance. Dependence on external energy sources exposed economies to price shocks and political pressure. Disruptions in energy markets triggered widespread inflation and economic instability. Governments responded by diversifying suppliers, investing in domestic production, and accelerating energy transitions. These efforts reshaped global energy flows, altering trade patterns and geopolitical relationships. Energy security became inseparable from economic security. Food supply chains followed a similar pattern. Agricultural exports, fertilizers, and transportation networks became instruments of influence. Restrictions and disruptions affected global food prices, hitting vulnerable populations hardest. International organizations warned that weaponizing food supply chains could exacerbate instability and humanitarian crises. Yet the logic of the new Cold War encouraged states to prioritize national resilience over global efficiency, even when the costs were high. Corporations faced unprecedented challenges. Business models built on just-in-time production struggled to adapt. Inventory strategies shifted toward redundancy and stockpiling. Costs increased as firms diversified suppliers and relocated production. Shareholders questioned profitability, while governments pressured companies to align with national strategies. The private sector found itself navigating a landscape where economic decisions carried geopolitical consequences. Global news reflected these shifts. Headlines focused on reshoring, nearshoring, and friendshoring. Countries sought to bring critical production closer to home or within trusted alliances. Trade agreements emphasized security and reliability rather than pure economic gain. The language of efficiency gave way to the language of resilience. Analysts observed that this transition marked a fundamental departure from decades of economic orthodoxy. Economic statistics confirmed the trade-offs. Resilient supply chains were more expensive. Production costs rose. Consumer prices increased. Growth slowed. Yet policymakers accepted these outcomes as the price of reduced vulnerability. The calculus of economic success changed. Stability and control mattered more than short-term profit. In a world defined by strategic competition, supply chains became assets to defend rather than systems to optimize. The fragmentation of supply chains contributed to the broader division of the global economy. Regions aligned production with political alliances. Cross-border integration weakened. Smaller economies struggled to adapt, caught between competing blocs. The promise of globalization gave way to a more fragmented, contested landscape. Economists warned that reduced integration could lower global productivity and innovation over time, but the momentum toward fragmentation proved difficult to reverse. What made supply chains particularly powerful as weapons was their invisibility. Unlike sanctions or tariffs, disruptions often appeared accidental or technical. Responsibility was diffuse. Governments could deny intent while benefiting from the pressure applied. This ambiguity made supply chain warfare difficult to regulate or respond to through international institutions. The rules-based system struggled to address conflicts embedded within logistics and production networks. The strategic use of supply chains reshaped perceptions of power. Control over manufacturing capacity, logistics hubs, and critical inputs became as important as military strength. Nations invested heavily in infrastructure, subsidies, and industrial policy. Competition intensified not only over markets, but over the ability to produce. The global economy entered an era where supply chains were no longer neutral conduits of trade, but contested terrain in a silent conflict. As this transformation unfolded, the risks multiplied. Concentration of production shifted rather than disappeared. New dependencies formed within alliances. Redundancy reduced efficiency, but did not eliminate vulnerability. The system became more complex, harder to manage, and more sensitive to political shocks. Each attempt to secure supply chains introduced new points of friction. The weaponization of supply chains marked a defining feature of the new Cold War. Economic competition moved deeper into the structures that sustain everyday life. Decisions about where goods are made, how they move, and who controls key inputs acquired strategic significance. The consequences reached far beyond governments and corporations, shaping inflation, employment, and living standards worldwide. The world had entered a phase where supply chains were no longer simply economic infrastructure. They were instruments of power. And as nations continued to reshape them in the name of security, the global economy moved further away from the cooperative model that once defined globalization, toward a system governed by rivalry, precaution, and strategic control. As supply chains became instruments of strategic pressure, their long-term consequences began to reshape the global economy in ways that went far beyond temporary disruption. What initially looked like a tactical response to geopolitical tension evolved into a structural transformation of how goods, technology, and resources moved across borders. The logic of security replaced the logic of efficiency, and with it came a cascade of economic effects that altered growth patterns, inflation dynamics, and global development trajectories. One of the most immediate consequences was persistent cost pressure. Fragmented supply chains reduced economies of scale and eliminated many of the efficiencies that globalization had built over decades. Companies faced higher input prices, duplicated production lines, and increased compliance costs. These expenses were passed on to consumers, contributing to sustained inflation across multiple regions. Economists observed that unlike temporary price shocks, these pressures were structural. Once supply chains were reconfigured for resilience rather than efficiency, prices rarely returned to previous levels. Industrial policy expanded rapidly as governments sought to secure domestic production capacity. Subsidies, tax incentives, and direct investment programs aimed to attract manufacturers and rebuild strategic industries. While these policies strengthened national control, they also distorted markets. Capital allocation increasingly followed political priorities rather than comparative advantage. This shift reduced overall productivity growth and increased fiscal burdens. Public spending rose as states competed to attract and retain critical industries, intensifying global subsidy races. Technology supply chains revealed particularly deep vulnerabilities. Advanced manufacturing relied on highly specialized equipment, intellectual property, and skilled labor concentrated in a limited number of locations. Attempts to replicate these ecosystems domestically required enormous investment and time. In the interim, restrictions on technology flows slowed innovation and raised barriers to entry. Research collaboration declined as geopolitical considerations overshadowed scientific openness. Analysts warned that innovation fragmentation could reduce the pace of technological progress globally, with long-term consequences for productivity and living standards. Developing economies faced difficult trade-offs. Many had integrated deeply into global supply chains as manufacturing hubs, benefiting from foreign investment and export-driven growth. Fragmentation disrupted these models. Some countries lost access to markets or investment as production relocated closer to political allies. Others faced pressure to choose sides, aligning with one bloc at the expense of another. This realignment introduced uncertainty and constrained policy autonomy. International development organizations cautioned that prolonged fragmentation could widen inequality between regions, reversing gains achieved through decades of integration. The labor market effects were complex. In some advanced economies, reshoring created jobs and revitalized certain regions. However, these jobs often required higher skills, and automation reduced overall employment intensity. In parallel, consumers faced higher prices, eroding real wages. In export-dependent economies, job losses occurred as factories closed or investment slowed. The net global effect was uneven, with gains concentrated in specific sectors and losses dispersed broadly across populations. Logistics and transportation networks also transformed. Strategic control over ports, shipping routes, and infrastructure gained prominence. Investments shifted toward redundancy and security, increasing costs and complexity. Insurance premiums rose as geopolitical risk was priced into shipping and trade finance. Disruptions in key corridors reverberated through global markets, affecting commodity prices and availability. What once functioned as a seamless global system became a patchwork of guarded routes and contingency plans. Financial markets adjusted to the new reality with heightened sensitivity to geopolitical signals. Supply chain announcements moved stock prices. Export restrictions triggered market volatility. Investors incorporated political risk into valuations more aggressively. Long-term planning became more difficult as regulatory environments shifted rapidly. This uncertainty reduced investment and encouraged shorter time horizons, further dampening growth prospects. The environmental impact added another layer of consequence. Duplicated production facilities increased resource consumption and emissions. Shorter, less efficient supply routes replaced optimized global networks. While some reshoring initiatives align with sustainability goals, many resulted in higher environmental costs. Balancing security with climate commitments became increasingly complex, forcing policymakers to navigate competing priorities. International institutions struggled to respond. Trade rules designed for an era of integration proved ill-suited to a world of strategic fragmentation. Dispute resolution mechanisms lost effectiveness as national security exceptions expanded. Coordination weakened as trust declined. Efforts to reform global governance faced resistance from states prioritizing autonomy over cooperation. The rules-based system eroded gradually, not through abandonment, but through selective compliance. The strategic use of supply chains also changed the nature of deterrence. Instead of threatening military retaliation, states signaled their ability to disrupt access to essential goods and technologies. This form of deterrence was subtle but powerful. It operated continuously rather than episodically, shaping behavior through anticipation rather than response. However, it also increased the risk of miscalculation. Disruptions intended as pressure could escalate into broader economic crises if dependencies were underestimated. Public perception evolved alongside these changes. Consumers experienced higher prices and reduced choice. Businesses faced uncertainty and complexity. Governments framed resilience as protection, but citizens questioned the trade-offs. Political debates intensified over the balance between security and prosperity. The cost of the new Cold War became tangible in everyday life, even as its strategic rationale remained abstract. Over time, the cumulative impact of weaponized supply chains reshaped global power dynamics. States with control over critical inputs gained leverage. Those lacking access faced constraints on growth and autonomy. Alliances deepened around shared supply networks, reinforcing bloc formation. Neutrality became harder to sustain in a world where production itself was politicized. Yet the system remained unstable. Fragmentation reduced efficiency without eliminating vulnerability. New choke points emerged. Dependencies shifted rather than disappeared. The pursuit of absolute security proved elusive. Each attempt to control supply chains introduced new risks and costs, locking the global economy into a cycle of precaution and reaction. The long-term consequence was a slower, more divided world economy. Growth became harder to achieve. Inflation pressures persisted. Innovation slowed as collaboration fractured. While some nations strengthened resilience, the collective cost was high. Economists increasingly describe the new Cold War as a negative-sum competition, where gains in security came at the expense of shared prosperity. Supply chains, once symbols of global cooperation, had become instruments of strategic rivalry. Their weaponization marked a decisive break from the assumptions that guided globalization. The world entered an era where economic infrastructure itself was contested, and where stability depended not on integration, but on controlled separation. As this transformation continued, the question shifted from whether supply chains could be secured to whether the global economy could function effectively under permanent fragmentation. The answer remained uncertain. What was clear, however, was that the battlefield of the new Cold War now ran through factories, ports, and logistics networks, through the systems that sustain modern life. And as long as supply chains remained strategic weapons, the economic conflict would persist, shaping the future of global power in ways that no missile ever could. As the new Cold War deepened, technology and data emerged as the most powerful and least visible front of economic confrontation. Unlike traditional supply chains, which move physical goods, digital infrastructure operates continuously and silently, shaping economies, societies, and state power in real time. Control over technology no longer meant dominance in a single sector. It meant influence over communication, production, finance, surveillance, and decision-making itself. In this environment, data became the new strategic resource, and digital systems became instruments of economic control. For decades, technological globalization was driven by efficiency and innovation. Software, hardware, and data flowed across borders with minimal friction. Global platforms connected billions of users. Cloud infrastructure, centralized information, and digital services became essential to everyday life. This integration created enormous value, but it also concentrated power. A small number of states and corporations gained control over critical digital infrastructure, from semiconductor design to operating systems, cloud computing, and financial networks. As geopolitical tensions intensified, this concentration transformed from an advantage into a strategic weapon. Governments increasingly recognized that technological dependence carried risks comparable to military vulnerability. Access to advanced chips, software updates, cloud services, and data analytics could be restricted or withdrawn. Digital platforms could be regulated, blocked, or fragmented. Entire sectors could be disrupted through decisions that appeared administrative rather than confrontational. What once functioned as neutral infrastructure now reflected geopolitical alignment and strategic intent. Global news highlighted this shift repeatedly. Export controls on advanced technologies expanded beyond military applications to encompass civilian industries. Restrictions targeted artificial intelligence, high-performance computing, telecommunications equipment, and manufacturing tools. These measures aim to preserve technological advantage and limit rivals' capabilities. Economists observe that technology controls were not short-term pressure tactics, but long-term strategies designed to shape development trajectories. By slowing access to critical tools, states sought to lock in asymmetries that would persist for years. Data emerged as a parallel battlefield. Information generated by individuals, companies, and governments became a valuable asset for economic planning, market prediction, and security operations. Control over data flows allowed states to influence innovation, monitor behavior, and enhance surveillance capabilities. Regulations governing data localization, privacy, and cross-border transfer increasingly reflected strategic priorities rather than purely ethical concerns. Countries demanded that data be stored domestically, limiting foreign access and increasing state oversight. This shift fragmented the digital economy and reduced the free flow of information that once underpinned global innovation. Digital surveillance capabilities expanded rapidly. Governments invested in data analytics, biometric systems, and artificial intelligence to monitor economic activity, population movement, and financial transactions. These tools enhanced internal control and economic enforcement. At the same time, they raised concerns about civil liberties and market fairness. Businesses operating across borders face complex compliance requirements, balancing data access with regulatory risk. The cost of operating in multiple digital jurisdictions increased, reducing efficiency and raising barriers to entry. The financial system became deeply intertwined with this technological front. Digital payment networks, settlement systems, and compliance platforms relied on software and data infrastructure controlled by a limited number of providers. Access to these systems determined participation in global finance. Restrictions could isolate institutions rapidly, freezing assets and halting transactions. The integration of technology and finance amplified the reach of economic pressure, allowing states to enforce policy decisions instantly and at scale. Technology standards became another arena of competition. Technical specifications for networks, software, and devices shape markets and lock in long-term advantages. States sought to influence international standard-setting bodies, recognizing that standards determine which technologies dominate globally. Competing ecosystems emerged, each with its own protocols, regulations, and supply networks. This divergence increased incompatibility, reduced interoperability, and raised costs for businesses and consumers alike. The promise of a unified digital economy gave way to parallel systems reflecting geopolitical divisions. Corporate power played a central role in this transformation. Major technology firms operated across borders, controlling platforms used by governments, businesses, and individuals. Their decisions carried geopolitical consequences, whether intended or not. Compliance with national regulations could limit operations elsewhere. Market access depended on alignment with state priorities. Companies faced growing pressure to choose sides, aligning technology development and data practices with political realities. The boundary between private enterprise and state strategy blurred. Economic statistics reflected the impact of digital fragmentation. Investment patterns shifted as firms reassessed risk. Research collaboration declined across geopolitical divides. The cost of technology development increased as duplication replaced specialization. Smaller economies struggled to keep pace, lacking resources to build independent digital ecosystems. The global digital divide widened, reinforcing existing inequalities and creating new forms of dependency. The workforce felt these changes as well. Digital skills became increasingly strategic assets. States invested heavily in domestic talent development, recognizing that human capital underpinned technological sovereignty. Immigration policies shifted to protect sensitive knowledge while attracting skilled workers. Competition for talent intensified, further politicizing labor markets. Innovation clusters aligned with national priorities rather than global collaboration. International institutions struggled to adapt. Existing frameworks were designed for trading goods, not control over algorithms and data. Dispute resolution mechanisms proved inadequate for conflicts rooted in digital governance. As a result, states acted unilaterally, imposing regulations and restrictions that reflected domestic security concerns. Coordination weakened as trust declined. The rules-based order eroded, not through collapse, but through selective disengagement. Public perception evolved alongside these developments. Digital services became more expensive, fragmented, and regulated. Users experienced restrictions on access, functionality, and interoperability. Governments framed these changes as necessary for security and sovereignty. Critics warned that fragmentation reduced innovation and economic opportunity. The debate over digital control mirrored the broader tensions of the new Cold War, balancing freedom against security, efficiency against resilience. What made the technological front particularly destabilizing was its invisibility. Unlike tariffs or sanctions, digital restrictions often operated behind the scenes. Users noticed changes only when services failed or access was denied. Responsibility was difficult to assign, and accountability was diffuse. This opacity made escalation harder to predict and manage. A software update, regulatory change, or infrastructure decision could trigger economic consequences across multiple sectors simultaneously. As technology and data became instruments of power, the nature of economic competition changed fundamentally. Control over information systems allowed states to influence not only markets, but behavior, perception, and decision-making. Economic surveillance extended beyond compliance into strategic insight. Data-driven governance enhanced efficiency while increasing control. The implications extended beyond economics into politics, society, and individual autonomy. The new Cold War thus expanded into the digital realm, embedding conflict within the systems that manage modern life. Technology was no longer merely a driver of growth. It was a strategic domain, contested and controlled. Data was no longer just information, it was leverage. And as states continued to invest in technological sovereignty, the global economy moved further away from openness toward a model defined by segmentation, oversight, and strategic rivalry. The digital front of this conflict was still evolving. Its full consequences had yet to be realized. But one fact was already clear. The struggle for technological control would shape economic power as decisively as any military confrontation. And in a world where data flows define productivity, security, and influence, the battle over technology was not a side conflict. It was the core of the new Cold War. As technological rivalry intensified, economic surveillance moved from a supporting role to a central pillar of the new Cold War. States no longer relied solely on tariffs, sanctions, or export controls to shape outcomes. They built systems capable of observing, predicting, and influencing economic behavior at scale. Data collection, algorithmic analysis, and digital compliance frameworks allowed governments to monitor markets and enforce policy in real time. Power shifted from episodic intervention to continuous oversight. The expansion of digital compliance infrastructure illustrated this transformation. Financial institutions were required to integrate advanced monitoring systems to track transactions, identify risk, and enforce restrictions. Supply chain transparency mandates compelled companies to map production networks in detail, exposing dependencies that could be regulated or restricted. What was framed as risk management or consumer protection also created unprecedented visibility into economic activity. Governments gained insight not only into trade flows, but into corporate strategy, investment decisions, and technological development. Economic statistics reflected the growing reach of surveillance. Compliance costs rose steadily across industries. Smaller firms struggled to meet complex reporting requirements, while larger corporations invested heavily in legal and technological capacity. Market entry barriers increased, reducing competition and favoring incumbents aligned with regulatory frameworks. Analysts observed that regulatory complexity became a competitive advantage for firms with resources, reinforcing concentration and limiting innovation. Digital currencies and payment systems added another layer. Central bank digital currency projects advanced as states sought greater control over monetary transmission and financial visibility. While often justified as tools for efficiency and inclusion, These systems promised real-time insight into transactions and balances. Economists debated their implications, noting that programmable money could enable targeted policy enforcement, from sanctions to stimulus, with unprecedented precision. The line between monetary policy and economic surveillance blurred further. Cross-border data restrictions accelerated fragmentation. Data localization laws force companies to store and process information within national borders, reducing exposure to foreign oversight but increasing operational costs. Multinational firms duplicated infrastructure to comply with divergent rules. Innovation slowed as data sharing declined. Research collaboration became more constrained, particularly in sensitive fields such as artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and advanced manufacturing. The global knowledge network that once fueled rapid progress fractured along geopolitical lines. Technology ecosystems diverged accordingly. Competing platforms, standards, and regulatory regimes reduced interoperability. Software developed for one market required modification for another. Hardware compatibility decreased. Consumers faced limited choice and higher prices, while developers navigated fragmented markets. The promise of scale that defined the digital age weakened as markets segmented. Economists warned that fragmentation reduced returns on innovation, discouraging long-term investment. Economic surveillance also reshaped labor markets. Remote work, digital platforms, and cross-border collaboration were subject to new controls. Data access rules affected hiring, outsourcing, and project management. States scrutinized workforce composition in strategic sectors, restricting foreign participation and tightening security clearance requirements. Competition for skilled labor intensified within trusted blocs, exacerbating shortages elsewhere. Talent mobility, once a driver of innovation, became politicized. The geopolitical implications were significant. Surveillance capabilities enhanced deterrence by increasing the cost of defection. States could detect attempts to circumvent restrictions more effectively, discouraging noncompliance. At the same time, this visibility increased the risk of escalation. Misinterpretation of data or automated enforcement actions could trigger unintended consequences. The speed of digital systems reduced time for diplomatic resolution, amplifying the impact of errors. Market behavior adapted to this environment. Firms diversified not only suppliers, but also data providers, cloud services, and compliance partners. Redundancy became standard practice. Investors incorporated regulatory and surveillance risk into valuations, favoring companies embedded within stable regulatory regimes. Capital allocation followed political alignment more closely than economic fundamentals. The integration of surveillance into economic governance altered incentives across the system. Public debate reflected growing unease. Citizens questioned the trade-offs between security and privacy, resilience, and freedom. Governments emphasized protection against external threats, while critics warned of domestic overreach and reduced competition. The economic cost of surveillance, higher prices, slower growth, and reduced choice became more visible. Yet, in a climate of strategic rivalry, these costs were often framed as necessary. International coordination continued to erode. Institutions struggled to reconcile divergent digital governance models. Attempts to establish common standards faltered as trust declined. States preferred unilateral control to multilateral compromise. The result was a patchwork of rules that increased friction and uncertainty. The rules-based order adapted unevenly, losing coherence as exceptions multiplied. Over time, economic surveillance reshaped the balance of power. States with advanced data capabilities gained leverage over markets and actors operating within their jurisdiction. Those lacking technological capacity faced disadvantages, dependent on external systems or excluded from high-value networks. Inequality widened between economies able to invest in surveillance infrastructure and those unable to do so. The cumulative effect was a global economy governed as much by observation as by exchange. Markets still functioned, but under constant monitoring. Decisions, once driven by price signals, were influenced by compliance risk and political alignment. Innovation continued, but within constrained corridors defined by regulation and oversight. The efficiency gains of openness gave way to the predictability of control. This transformation reinforced the logic of the new Cold War. Economic competition no longer relied primarily on episodic shocks. It operated through persistent pressure embedded in digital systems. Surveillance ensured that leverage could be applied swiftly and selectively. The battlefield expanded beyond factories and ports into databases, algorithms, and compliance dashboards. As technological separation deepened, the challenge became systemic. Fragmentation reduced shared understanding and increased mistrust. Surveillance strengthened enforcement but weakened cooperation. The global economy grew more cautious, slower, and less integrated. While some states achieved greater control, collective resilience declined. The second-order consequences were profound. Innovation ecosystems splintered, costs rose, growth slowed. The benefits of globalization diminished while the risks of rivalry increased. Economic surveillance, intended to secure advantage, contributed to an environment of perpetual tension. The digital front thus completed the transformation of conflict. Technology, data, and surveillance became not just tools, but the terrain itself. In this landscape, power was exercised continuously, invisibly, and at scale. The new Cold War did not pause between crises. It operated every day through systems designed to watch, measure, and control. And as these systems expanded, the question confronting the world grew sharper. Could an economy built on constant observation sustain trust and innovation? Or would control ultimately undermine the prosperity it sought to protect? The answer would define not only the outcome of the new Cold War, but the future shape of global economic life. The culmination of the new Cold War is not a dramatic confrontation, but the gradual emergence of a fragmented global order. Power no longer concentrates in a single center, nor does it flow freely through integrated markets. Instead, the world is reorganizing into economic blocks defined by trust, security, and political alignment. This transformation reshapes trade, finance, and growth in ways that will define global stability for decades. The fragmentation of the global economy alters how nations interact. Trade increasingly occurs within trusted networks, rather than across open markets. Regional agreements replace global frameworks. Supply chains shorten and specialize, reinforcing bloc cohesion while reducing cross-bloc dependence. Economic statistics reveal a steady shift toward regional trade intensity, with growth concentrated inside aligned groups and reduced exposure to external partners. While this structure enhances predictability for some, it reduces overall efficiency and limits the scale benefits that once drove global expansion. Financial systems reflect a similar pattern. Capital flows increasingly follow political alignment rather than pure return. Investors evaluate regulatory compatibility, sanction risk, and geopolitical exposure alongside fundamentals. This realignment changes the cost of capital across regions. Economies embedded in stable blocks benefit from lower risk premiums, while those on the margins face higher borrowing costs and constrained access to finance. Over time, this divergence amplifies inequality between regions, shaping development trajectories. Economic growth in this fragmented environment becomes harder to sustain. Redundant production, duplicated infrastructure, and compliance overhead increase costs. Productivity growth slows as specialization declines and innovation networks fragment. Inflationary pressure persists as efficiency losses accumulate. Economists note that while individual blocks may achieve resilience, the global system loses momentum. Growth becomes uneven, volatile, and more dependent on policy intervention. Political power evolves alongside these economic changes. States gain leverage within their blocks, but lose influence globally. Decision-making shifts from multilateral institutions towards smaller coalitions capable of enforcing rules internally. This reduces coordination during crises. Global challenges such as financial instability, climate risk, and public health become harder to manage without shared frameworks. The ability to respond collectively diminishes as trust erodes. The new Cold War also reshapes international norms. Economic coercion becomes normalized, blurring the boundary between competition and conflict. Sanctions, restrictions, and regulatory pressure are accepted tools of statecraft. Over time, this normalization reduces the deterrent effect of such measures. As more actors adapt, the impact of economic weapons declines, encouraging escalation and experimentation. The system becomes less predictable, increasing the risk of miscalculation. Smaller economies face particularly difficult choices. Alignment with a bloc offers security but limits autonomy. Remaining neutral becomes increasingly challenging as supply chains, finance, and technology systems align along political lines. Countries outside major blocs navigate a narrow path, balancing access and independence. Development strategies adjust accordingly, prioritizing resilience over integration. International organizations warn that this environment could entrench long-term disparities and slow global convergence. Technological divergence accelerates these trends. Competing standards, platforms, and data regimes reduce interoperability. Innovation continues, but within segmented ecosystems. Breakthroughs diffuse more slowly across blocks, limiting global spillovers. Talent mobility declines as security concerns restrict movement. Over time, the pace of global technological progress moderates, affecting productivity and living standards worldwide. Public sentiment responds to these shifts with mixed reactions. Governments frame fragmentation as protection against vulnerability. Citizens experience higher prices, reduced choice, and slower growth. Political narratives emphasize security and sovereignty, often at the expense of openness and cooperation. The social contract adapts to a world where economic stability is prioritized over maximum efficiency. Despite these challenges, the fragmented order is not inherently unstable. Blocs develop internal mechanisms for coordination and crisis management. Regional institutions gain importance. New forms of cooperation emerge within aligned groups. The system adapts, albeit at a lower level of integration. The question is not whether the world will function, but how effectively it will do so under persistent division. Historical parallels offer perspective. Previous eras of fragmentation produced both conflict and innovation. The outcome depended on the balance between competition and coordination. In the current context, economic interdependence remains significant, even as trust declines. This interdependence acts as a constraint on escalation, encouraging managed rivalry rather than total separation. The new Cold War operates within these limits, shaping behavior through pressure rather than confrontation. The future of global power thus lies in adaptation. States that invest in resilience, human capital, and technological capacity will navigate fragmentation more effectively. Those that rely solely on access and openness may struggle. Economic leadership shifts toward actors capable of balancing security with innovation, control with flexibility. The new Cold War does not promise clear victory or defeat. It defines an era of sustained competition embedded in everyday economic life. Markets remain active, but under constraint. Cooperation persists, but selectively. Power is exercised continuously, not episodically. As this order solidifies, the legacy of globalization fades. The assumption that integration guarantees peace is replaced by a recognition that interdependence can be weaponized. Economic decisions become strategic choices. Growth becomes conditional. Stability becomes managed rather than assumed. The world enters a phase where economics replaces weapons as the primary arena of rivalry. The consequences unfold slowly, shaping institutions, societies, and expectations. The new Cold War will not be remembered for battles fought, but for systems built, divided, and controlled. And in this divided world, the ultimate test will not be who dominates, but whether global prosperity can survive permanent competition without cooperation. The new Cold War will not end with a treaty. It will not be won on a battlefield, and it will not be visible until its consequences are unavoidable. As the global economy fragments, power shifts quietly from cooperation to control. Growth slows, costs rise, trust disappears. This is not a temporary phase. It is a structural transformation of how the world works. Economics has replaced weapons. Markets have replaced battlefields, and the conflict is no longer optional. The question is not who will win. The question is whether global prosperity can survive a world built on permanent economic rivalry. This is the new Cold War, and it is only just beginning.